The dust was a fine red powder that coated everything, clinging to the inside of Lynn's mouth and settling in the folds of her simple cotton trousers. For 3 weeks, this dust had been her constant companion, stirred up by the plodding hooves of the freight wagon's mules. When the wagon finally groaned to a halt, the sudden silence was louder than the preceding noise. The air in Serenity Flats, Montana Territory, was heavy with the dry heat of a late summer afternoon and the sharp, metallic smell of hot iron. The driver, a man whose face was a road map of sun-cracked leather, gestured with his thumb toward a squat building of rough-hewn timber. A plume of dark smoke drifted from its stone chimney. "This is it, miss. Blackwood's smithy." From within the building, the rhythmic, ringing clang of a hammer on an anvil stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. A few townsfolk, loitering on the boardwalk across the street, paused their conversations and turned to stare. Their eyes were not kind. They were curious, but with a hard, unwelcoming edge. Lynn clutched the small, cloth-wrapped bundle in her lap, the only possession she had brought from a life she would never see again. The door of the smithy swung open, casting a tall, broad shadow that momentarily blocked out the blinding sun. A man stepped into the light. He was larger than she had imagined, with arms thick as fence posts and a leather apron stained with soot and sweat. But it was his face that made her breath catch in her throat. The left side was a ruin of puckered, glossy scar tissue that pulled at the corner of his eye and twisted his mouth into a permanent, grim line. It was a face that told a story of terrible violence, of fire and pain. He wiped a hand across his brow, leaving a streak of grime, and his one good eye, a startlingly clear blue, fixed on her. This was Silas Blackwood. The man her father's letter had described as a respectable man of property, the man she had crossed an ocean and a continent to marry. He looked from her small frame to the driver, a question in his gaze. The driver just shrugged. "She's the one, Blackwood." Straight from the docks in San Francisco, just like the letter said, he untied her small trunk from the back of the wagon and dropped it into the dust with a thud. He did not offer her a hand down. Silas Blackwood said nothing. He just stared, his expression unreadable, a mixture of shock and something that looked like profound regret. Lynn knew, in that searing moment of silence, that he had never truly expected her to arrive. Silas finally moved, his steps deliberate as he crossed the dusty space between them. He stopped before the wagon, looking up at her. He didn't offer a hand either, but he spoke, his voice a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together. "You are Lynn?" He said the name carefully, as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He gestured toward the smithy. "Come inside." Out of the sun it wasn't a welcome. It was a command, born of practicality, but it was the first small kindness she had been shown in this new, terrifying world. As she carefully climbed down from the wagon, the whispers from the boardwalk followed her like a swarm of angry bees. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark doorway of the smithy, ignoring the stares and the hostile silence of the town. This was her life now. The scarred blacksmith and the silence. The interior of the smithy was a cavern of organized chaos. Tools hung from the walls in precise arrangements, barrels of iron rods stood in corners, and the great forge dominated the far wall, its coals still glowing with a predatory heat. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and quenching steam. It was a man's world, built of fire and force. Silas led her past the anvil and the slack tub to a door at the back. It opened into 2 small, spare rooms, a main room with a table, 2 chairs, and a cold cookstove, and a second, smaller room with a narrow cot. Everything was covered in the same fine layer of soot that seemed to coat the entire property. He set her trunk down by the cot. "This will be yours," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the bare room. He gestured to the main room. "I sleep out here." He ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup and offered it to her. His scarred hand was steady. She took it, her fingers brushing against his calloused skin, and drank the cool, metallic-tasting water in 3 long swallows. They stood in an awkward silence, 2 strangers bound by a piece of paper that had traveled thousands of miles. He was a mountain of a man, and she felt impossibly small and fragile in his presence. He seemed to know it, keeping a careful distance. He pointed to himself. Silas, then he pointed to her. Lynn, she nodded again. The chasm between their worlds felt as wide as the Pacific Ocean. He seemed about to say something more, but a shadow fell across the open doorway of the smithy. A man stood there, dressed in a clean town coat and a bowler hat. He was trim and well-kept, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that missed nothing. "Blackwood," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "I see your package has arrived." He did not look at Lynn, but his words were meant for her, sharp and dismissive. Silas turned slowly, his body positioning itself between Lynn and the newcomer. "What do you want, Thorne?" Jebediah Thorne, owner of the Serenity Flats General Mercantile, smiled a thin, unpleasant smile. "Just being a good neighbor. Making sure you're settled. It's not every day our town gets such an exotic new resident." He let his gaze drift over Lynn, lingering for a moment before returning to Silas. "I trust she'll be kept indoors. Wouldn't want to frighten the locals." The threat was veiled in politeness, but it was as sharp as a razor. Silas's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing under the scarred skin. He said nothing, simply staring at Thorne until the man's smile faltered. With a final, contemptuous glance, Thorne tipped his hat and walked away. The encounter left a chill in the hot air. Lynn now understood that the town's hostility had a source and a name. The first few weeks passed in a strained, nearly silent routine. Lynn rose before dawn, tidying the small living quarters until they were spotless. The layers of soot gave way to clean wood. She found a small patch of earth behind the smithy and, using a broken spade she'd found, began to turn the soil, planting the few seeds she had carried with her. Silas would work from sunup to sundown, the ceaseless ring of his hammer the only real conversation between them. He left coins on the table for supplies each morning. Her first trip to Thorne's Mercantile was an ordeal. The moment she stepped inside, the half-dozen customers fell silent. Jebediah Thorne stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a cloth. He watched her approach as if she were a stray dog that had wandered in. She pointed to flour, salt, and beans. He named a price that she knew, even with her limited understanding, was double what it should be. As she counted out the coins, two men lounging by the cracker barrel began to speak loudly in a crude, mocking imitation of her native tongue. Heat flooded her cheeks. She kept her eyes down, her hands trembling slightly. Suddenly, the doorway darkened. Silas filled the frame, his massive form blocking the afternoon light. He didn't say a word. He walked to the counter, his heavy work boots thudding on the floorboards. He looked at the items, then at Thorne. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of coins, and placed the correct, fair price on the counter with a decisive click. He then turned his head and looked at the two men by the barrel. His gaze was flat, cold, and utterly devoid of fear. The men stopped their mocking laughter, suddenly finding their boots very interesting. Silas picked up the sack of flour, gestured for Lynn to take the rest, and walked out. She hurried after him, her heart pounding. He had defended her. In his silent, intimidating way, he had stood for her. It wasn't gentle, but it was something. It was a start. Life with Silas began to take on a new rhythm, one dictated not by words but by shared work and quiet observation. Lynn discovered he was a man of fierce discipline. Every tool had its place, every task its proper time. She learned the sounds of his trade, the whoosh of the bellows, the hiss of hot steel in water, the varying tones of the hammer shaping metal for a horseshoe, a wagon wheel rim, or a plough blade. She saw the artistry in it, the way he could transform a lump of stubborn iron into something useful and strong. He was not just a brute swinging a hammer, he was a craftsman. In the evenings, she would mend his torn work shirts, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to the coarse fabric. She learned to cook on his stove, and soon the smell of baking bread and savory stews replaced the ever-present scent of coal dust in their small home. He, in turn, began to notice her. He saw the way she coaxed green shoots from the hard-packed earth in her garden. He saw the order she brought to his chaotic living space. One evening, he came in from the forge, exhausted and covered in grime, to find a bucket of hot water waiting for him and a clean cloth laid out. He stopped, looking at the simple offering, then at her. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was his version of thank you. They rarely spoke more than a few necessary words. Water's food done yet, a silent understanding was growing between them. She began to see past the scars on his face to the steady competence of his hands. He began to see past her foreignness to the quiet strength that radiated from her. One afternoon, she found him staring at a heavy, locked chest in the corner of the smithy. He ran a hand over the lid, his expression dark and distant. He never opened it, and she knew not to ask. It held a part of his life that was separate from the forge and the anvil, a secret he was not ready to share. What she did not yet know was that the contents of that chest were the reason Thorn was so determined to drive him out of Serenity Flats. One sweltering evening, after the forge had cooled and the stars had begun to appear in the vast Montana sky, they sat on the bench outside the smithy. The chirping of crickets filled the silence. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, Silas cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet air. "I never thought you would come," he said, his voice low. He wasn't looking at her, but at the dusty street. "I sent the letter to the agent in San Francisco a year ago. A man like me, a man with this face. I have no business with a wife." He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, his good eye held a deep, weary sadness. "The fire. It was on the railroad, laying track east of here. A boiler exploded." He didn't offer details, but the simple words hung in the air, a stark explanation for his ruined face and his solitary life. He had built walls around himself as strong as the iron he worked. Lynn listened, understanding some words and guessing at others. When he finished, she reached into the pocket of her trousers and pulled out a small object. It was a bird, intricately carved from a single piece of dark wood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. She held it in her palm for a moment, the wood smooth and familiar against her skin. It was the last gift her father had given her. She held it out for him to see. Then she pointed to the bird, then to herself, and made a sweeping gesture toward the east, toward the home she had left behind. She then gently placed the carved bird on the bench between them and pointed to the ground at her feet. She looked at him, her expression clear and steady. She was the bird, and she had flown a great distance. But this was where she had landed. This was her perch now. For the first time, Silas saw not a frightened girl or a business arrangement, but a woman of immense courage. A woman who had chosen to stay. Something in his guarded expression softened, the hard lines around his eye easing just a fraction. Their fragile peace was shattered the following week. A man in a city suit arrived on the morning stagecoach, carrying a leather satchel. He went directly to Thorn's mercantile and, an hour later, emerged with Thorn himself. They walked directly to the smithy and tacked a notice to the door. It was a legal document, full of dense language, but the words territorial ordinance, public nuisance, and notice of inspection were clear enough. Thorn was using the law as a weapon. The notice claimed that the smoke from the forge was a health hazard and that the structure itself was unsafe, pending an official inspection by this newly arrived agent. It was a pretext, a way to condemn the property so Thorn could seize it. Silas read the document, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He ripped it from the door and crumpled it in his fist. "He's been after this land for a year," Silas ground out, more to himself than to Lynn. "The smithy sits on the best well in town. Thorn wants it." He looked at Lynn, and the regret she had seen on the first day was back in his eyes. "He thinks you are my weakness. A way to pressure me." Thorn's campaign of harassment escalated. Deliveries of coal and iron that Silas had paid for were lost or delayed. People who had been his customers for years suddenly found reasons to take their business to the next town over. The whispers that had followed Lynn now followed them both. They were isolated, an island in a sea of suspicion and hostility, all of it orchestrated by Thorn. Silas grew quieter, more withdrawn, the weight of the fight pressing down on him. But the final straw came late one night. A storm was rolling in, the air thick and electric with the promise of lightning. Lynn was woken by a sound from the corral behind the smithy, a frantic whinny from Silas's big draft horse, Bess. It was a sound of pure terror. She quickly lit a lantern and ran to wake Silas. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a heavy iron poker from beside the cold forge. They ran out into the wind-whipped darkness. 2 figures were in the corral, trying to tie a rope laden with clattering tin cans to Bess's tail, intending to spook her into a frenzy, hoping she would break down a wall of the smithy or injure herself. They were Thorne's men. At the sight of Silas, a hulking silhouette against the lantern light, they froze. He didn't shout. He didn't charge. He simply walked toward them, the iron poker held loosely at his side. The message was clear. One of the men panicked and threw a rock, striking Silas high on the shoulder. He barely flinched. He just kept coming. The men scrambled over the fence and disappeared into the night. Silas calmed the trembling horse, his large hands gentle on her neck. He turned to Lynn, his face grim in the flickering light. "This is not your fight," he said, his voice rough with anger and something else, something that sounded like shame. "You should not be in this danger." The attack, meant to break him, did the opposite. It forged a new resolve in Silas. That night, after he had secured the corral and checked his horse, he walked back into the smithy. Lynn watched as he went to the heavy, locked chest in the corner. He pulled a key from his pocket and turned the lock. The lid creaked open. He reached inside and pulled out not a weapon, but a set of fine, delicate tools she had never seen before, tiny hammers, slender tongs, and delicate chisels. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was an object of breathtaking beauty. It was a flower, a rose, hammered from a sheet of steel. Each petal was exquisitely thin and curved, the stem thorny and lifelike. It was a masterpiece of artistry, but it was unfinished. He held it in his calloused palm. "The fire," he said, his voice thick with memory. It was not the railroad, he told her the truth. He had been a master ornamental smith in St. Louis, sought after by the city's wealthiest men. He was crafting a set of ornate gates for a powerful industrialist when the man's reckless adult son, in a drunken stupor, knocked over a lantern in the workshop. The place went up in flames. Silas dragged the young man out, but was trapped by a collapsing beam. He was burned, his face and hands horribly scarred. The industrialist, to protect his son from scandal and a prison sentence, paid Silas a great deal of money to disappear and take the blame, to let the world believe the fire was his own carelessness. Jebediah Thorne was his business partner, Silas finished, his voice bitter. "He knows the truth. He knows who I was. He thinks that secret gives him power over me." The beautiful, unfinished flower was the last thing he had been working on before his life was destroyed. He had kept it, and the tools of his old life, locked away as a constant reminder of all he had lost. Lynn looked from the steel rose to Silas's face. She finally understood the depth of the pain he carried, a pain far deeper than his physical scars. She went to the small table where he kept his papers and ledgers. She had been organizing them for weeks, trying to make sense of his accounts. She sifted through a pile of old letters and receipts until she found what she was looking for, a small bundle of correspondence tied with a string. They were letters from the industrialist in St. Louis and, more importantly, 2 letters from Thorne, referencing the unfortunate accident and the generous arrangement that had been made. It was all there. Proof of the cover-up. Proof of the blackmail. She held the bundle out to him. Her meaning was clear. His secret was not a source of shame. It was a weapon. For the first time in years, Silas did not see a reminder of his failure. He saw a chance for justice. A change came over him. The hunted look in his eye was replaced by a hard, clear light. He took the letters from her hand, his fingers closing around the brittle paper. The next morning, he did not light the forge. Instead, he put on his one clean shirt, took the letters, and walked to the office of the territorial marshal, who had just arrived on his monthly circuit. Then he came back to the smithy, and with a steady hand, he opened the chest, took out his finest tools, and began to work on the steel rose. For 2 days, the smithy was filled with a new sound, not the heavy clang of horseshoeing, but the delicate, precise tapping of a master craftsman at his true work. Silas finished the steel rose, burnishing the petals until they shone with a soft, dark light. He then forged a simple, elegant stand for it. On the third day, the day of Thorn's scheduled inspection, Silas did not wait for the agent to come to him. He took a small table and set it up in the middle of the street, directly in front of his smithy. He placed the steel rose on the table for all to see. People began to gather, drawn by the unusual sight. They saw not a clumsy tool, but a work of art, something none of them could have imagined coming from the hands of the scarred, silent blacksmith. Just as Thorn and the land agent approached, the territorial marshal stepped out of his office. He walked not toward Silas, but toward Thorn, a set of papers in his hand. "Jebediah Thorn," the marshal's voice boomed across the silent street, "I have here a warrant for your arrest on charges of extortion and conspiracy." Thorn's face went pale. The letters, combined with Silas's sworn testimony, had been enough. As the marshal led a sputtering, protesting Thorn away, the townspeople looked from the disgraced merchant to the blacksmith. And for the first time, they truly saw him. They saw the artist, not the monster. They saw the truth. 6 months later, the first snows of winter blanketed Serenity Flats. The wind that whistled down the main street was sharp and cold, but inside the expanded building that was now Blackwood and Company Fine Smithing, it was warm. Thorn was long gone, his mercantile sold to an honest family from Bozeman after the full extent of his corrupt dealings came to light. Silas's smithy was now renowned throughout the territory. Commissions for his fine metalwork, from delicate scrollwork to sturdy bank safes, came by telegraph and letter, which Lynn now answered in her increasingly fluent English. She managed the books, negotiated prices, and handled all the correspondence. The company on the new sign was her. The living quarters had been expanded, with real glass windows and a proper wooden floor. The steel rose sat on the mantelpiece above a warm, crackling fire. Silas was no longer the town outcast, he was its most respected artisan. He was still a man of few words, but the grim set of his mouth was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment. He was teaching Lynn the rudiments of his craft. He stood behind her at a small, clean workbench, his large, scarred hands guiding her smaller ones as she learned to shape a heated piece of iron. Their hands touched, a comfortable, familiar gesture. They had not found an easy life, but they had forged a strong one, built not on a business arrangement, but on a foundation of mutual respect and quiet courage. The scarred man and the foreign bride had found their home, not in a place, but in each other. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.